10 fighter jets in the air at once, a carrier strike group holding position off the coast, and a president who just told the world the United States has total control of the Strait of Hormuz. That is not a headline. That is a threat. Delivered in plain English, aimed straight at a regime that has spent 5 months pretending it still has options. And in the last 72 hours, that threat has only gotten louder. So buckle up, because today we are breaking down exactly what message the United States military just sent to Iran's mullahs, why it landed like a gut punch inside Tehran, and why the response from the regime tells you everything about how scared they actually are right now. Let's start with the words themselves, because words matter here more than people think. The president came out and said the United States has total control of the Strait of Hormuz, and then added that Iran could get blown away if it tries anything. Now, normally you'd hear a line like that and think it's just political noise, another tough quote for the cameras. But this one landed differently, because it came right after Iran's new security chief, a man named Mohsen Rezai, stood up and said the strait stays closed until the United States ends the war, lifts the blockade, and releases frozen assets. So you had two men on two sides of an ocean, both talking like they're the one holding the cards, except only one of them actually has warships, submarines, and fighter wings sitting in the water doing it. And that's the part Iran conveniently leaves out every time they go on state television. Here's the reality on the ground right now. United States Central Command has been running a blockade on Iranian ports for months, and the numbers tell the real story better than any press conference could. 44 commercial vessels redirected, 2 disabled, 2 boarded. That's not a metaphor, that's actual ships, actual cargo, actual revenue that never made it to where Iran wanted it to go. And every single one of those ships represents money the regime desperately needs and is not getting. So when Rezai goes on TV and says the strait stays closed, what he's really saying is, we can't open it ourselves, so we're going to pretend we're the ones closing it. It's the oldest trick in the book, and it's the same one we've watched them run for months now. Take a real weakness, wrap it in tough language, and hope nobody notices. The ships still aren't moving the way Iran wants them to. But before we go further, if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we break down exactly what's happening in this war every single day. No filters, no spin, just what the hardware and the numbers are actually telling us. And if this video's hitting different for you already, drop a like. It genuinely helps push this out to more people who need to see what's actually going on over there. Now let's talk about why this message landed so hard inside the regime, because it's not just about ships in the water, it's about what's happening at the very top of Iran's chain of command. On the 10th of August, the current supreme leader, a man named Mojtaba Khamenei, ordered the head of Iran's armed forces general staff to complete a merger between that general staff and something called the Khatam ul Anbiya Central Headquarters, which is Iran's wartime joint command structure. Translation: they are physically welding their military bureaucracy together because their old structure could not survive the war. Think about that for a second. This is a regime that just spent months getting hammered by decapitation strikes. Strikes that specifically targeted commanders and command centers, and their answer is not to negotiate their way out. Their answer is to bolt the Artesh and the IRGC together into one emergency structure, because apparently the old one couldn't even coordinate a response fast enough to survive. And that tells you something important. When a military reorganizes its command structure in the middle of an active war, that is not a sign of confidence. That's a sign of an organization that got its head cut off, watched its coordination collapse, and is now scrambling to stitch itself back together while missiles are still in the air. You don't restructure your entire chain of command because things are going great. You do it because the old chain of command got exposed, tested, and broken. Which brings us to the man at the center of all of this, Mojtaba Khamenei himself. Remember, this is not the original supreme leader. His father was killed back in February when a strike took out the previous leadership in a single coordinated operation. Mojtaba inherited the title in the chaos that followed, and for months there have been serious questions about whether he was even injured in those same strikes. Sources have described reports of a fractured foot and facial lacerations from that first day of bombardment. And for months the man barely appeared in public, feeding endless speculation about his condition, his location, and honestly, whether he was even the one actually running things day to day. Now, Iranian state media has said that new footage and public images of him are finally going to be released. Convenient timing, right in the middle of a war, right after a major military reorganization, right after the United States just said out loud that it controls the strait. If you were trying to prove to your own population and your own military that the man in charge is actually alive, actually capable, and actually in control, this is exactly when you'd want to push that footage out. Whether the population buys it is an entirely different question. Now let's talk about the money, because at the end of the day, wars are not just won with missiles, they're won with whoever runs out of cash first. And Iran is bleeding out financially in a way that's honestly hard to overstate. But the Treasury Secretary came out recently and said the regime is running out of ways to move money at all. And that's not just rhetoric, that's backed up by an entire sanctions campaign the administration has been running since April, something they've internally labeled economic fury. As of this past week, the campaign hit its 8th round of sanctions, specifically targeting Iran's shadow banking network, the exact system the regime uses to move money around sanctions in the first place. On top of that, there are fresh State Department actions, specifically targeting what officials are calling Iran's illicit cash pipeline and its digital asset exchanges. In plain English, they're not just cutting off the front door anymore, they're going after every single back door, every workaround, every crypto wallet the regime has been using to keep cash flowing. And Iran's own foreign ministry basically admitted defeat on this one without meaning to. The response to the new sanctions was that when previous rounds fail, American politicians simply increase the dose. Read that again. That's not a rebuttal. That's an admission that every previous round actually worked well enough that Washington felt the need to escalate. If the sanctions weren't doing damage, there'd be no reason to increase them. So even Iran's own messaging, buried inside their complaint, is quietly confirming the economic pressure campaign is landing exactly where it's supposed to. Now, let's go to Karg Island, because this is where the pain becomes very, very real for the regime. Somewhere around 90% of Iran's oil export revenue runs through just 3 berths on that island. 3. Not 3 ports, 3 specific berths. And multiple reports have shown those berths sitting empty for stretches, lasting anywhere from 10 to 22 days at a time. Think about what that actually means for a country that depends on oil exports to fund everything from its military to its proxy networks across the region. Every single day those berths sit empty is a day of revenue that simply vanishes and never comes back. It's not like they can just make it up next month. That oil isn't moving, that money isn't coming in, and the mullahs know it. And it's not just the empty berths either. Satellite imagery has picked up oil slicks spreading near Iran's own coastline, close to Keshem Island, right at the edge of the Strait of Hormuz, spreading into mangrove forests that are actually important habitats for marine wildlife in the region. Local officials in Iran are calling it a possible marine source and saying a cleanup is underway, but let's be honest about what that actually sounds like. A regime that is simultaneously trying to control the busiest oil choke point on the planet, running a blockade against it from the outside, and now dealing with an oil spill polluting its own coastline, is a regime that is losing control of its own operational environment on every single front at once. The ocean itself is turning into evidence of how badly this is going for them. If you're starting to see the pattern here, that's exactly the point. And this is where it gets interesting. So make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to connect a few dots that most of the mainstream coverage completely glosses over. Let's talk about what's happening inside Iran itself, because the picture painted by state media and the picture painted by human rights monitors are 2 completely different worlds. According to an Iranian human rights organization that tracks executions inside the country, the toll since the start of this year has climbed past 900, with more than a dozen carried out in August alone. 900 executions in roughly 7 months. That is not a government managing a war. That is a government managing an uprising it cannot fully put down using the only tool it has left, which is fear. Back in the spring, European diplomatic officials publicly described the pace of these executions as appalling and called on Iranian authorities to release people who had been arrested simply for protesting. When a regime is executing its own citizens at that rate, while simultaneously trying to convince the world it's negotiating from a position of strength, those 2 things cannot both be true. A government that feels secure does not need to kill this many of its own people to stay in power. And that's really the core contradiction sitting underneath everything Iran has said this week. On one hand, you have officials going on state television talking about legal frameworks, national sovereignty, and conditions for reopening the strait. On the other hand, you have a military that just merged its command structure out of necessity, a supreme leader whose own health and whereabouts have been a mystery for months, an economy hemorrhaging cash through every channel it has left, oil berths sitting empty for weeks at a time, and an execution rate that would be unthinkable in a country that actually felt stable. You cannot negotiate from strength while your own structure is being held together with duct tape behind the scenes. Now, let's zoom out for a second, because this war didn't start last week, and understanding where we are right now means understanding how we got here. Back in February, coordinated strikes hit Iranian military sites and leadership targets in a single operation, an operation that ultimately resulted in the death of the previous supreme leader. At the time, the sitting president made it clear that regime change was ultimately something he saw as being in the hands of the Iranian people themselves, but he was very open about the primary goal being the elimination of top leadership and the dismantling of Iran's military capability. That's a very different goal than simply degrading a few missile sites. That's a goal aimed at the head of the snake, not just the tail. And ever since that operation, we've watched wave after wave of pressure applied to keep that structure from ever fully reforming. Every time Iran tries to rebuild its chain of command, there's another strike, another set of sanctions, another blockade tightening, another warship added to the lineup. There have also been reports over the months of internal debate at the highest levels of the American government about how far to take this. Some officials reportedly pushed for even more direct strikes, specifically targeting security commanders and government institutions, hoping to embolden protesters who were already out in the streets, facing brutal crackdowns. Others in the administration urged more caution, worried about the risks of a broader regional war. That kind of internal disagreement tells you this isn't a simple binary situation where everyone in Washington agrees on exactly how far to push. But what's clear from the actions on the ground is that whatever hesitation existed early on has been steadily overridden by the reality of how this war has actually unfolded. The blockade has tightened, the sanctions have multiplied, the military pressure has stayed constant. And now, on top of all of that, you have the president directly telling Iran, in plain language, that the United States controls the strait, and Iran will get blown away if they push it. There's also a smaller story from the same window that tells you just how tense things have gotten, even for the people closest to the president. Reports surfaced that during a recent stop in Turkey, both the Secret Service and senior military officials wanted the president off Air Force One entirely because of a specific threat they were tracking. Now think about what that actually means operationally. Like when the protective detail around the most heavily guarded human being on the planet gets nervous enough to push for a change in plans mid-trip. That's not paranoia, that's intelligence. Somebody picked up on something real, something serious enough to change the movement of the most protected aircraft in the world. And that tells you the threat environment around this conflict isn't confined neatly to the Gulf. It's following the diplomacy wherever it goes, which is exactly the kind of pressure that makes any negotiation table twice as tense as it already would be. It's also worth remembering just how much hardware has been quietly moved into this theater since the buildup began back in January. We're not just talking about a couple of destroyers parked off the coast. Multiple carrier strike groups have rotated through the region. Naval special warfare units have been staged and ready. Marine expeditionary units, airborne divisions, mountain divisions, special operations, aviation regiments, and some of the most elite direct action units in the entire American military have all been positioned as part of this buildup at various points. That is not the footprint of a country planning to walk away quietly. That is the footprint of a country that built the entire toolkit needed for sustained pressure, rapid response, and if it ever came to it, direct action on the ground, and has kept that toolkit in place for months without pulling back. When people ask why Iran hasn't just called the bluff and pushed harder against the blockade, this is a big part of the answer. There is no bluff to call. The assets are actually there. They've been there for months, and they're not leaving. Let's also talk about the ammunition side of this, because it's important to be honest about the costs on the American side too, since a lot of channels covering this conflict love to only tell half the story. Reports have circulated that the United States has burned through a significant portion of its most advanced missile defense interceptors during this war, with some accounts suggesting nearly 80% of a key interceptor system's stockpile has been used up, compared to pre-war numbers, and roughly half of the Patriot interceptor stockpile has been consumed as well. Senior commanders have reportedly described the overall munitions stockpile as dangerously low. Now, is that a crack in America's armor? In some sense, yes, it's a real logistical challenge, and it's one that defense planners are clearly taking seriously behind the scenes. But here's the thing people miss when they read a headline like that and panic. Running low on interceptors after 5 straight months of active combat operations against a hostile regional power is not the same as running low on the will or the capability to keep pressure on. It means the resupply chain needs to catch up, and it almost certainly will, because that's exactly what defense industrial mobilization exists to do. Iran, on the other hand, isn't running low on interceptors. Iran is running low on money, on ports, on functioning command structures, and on public trust. Those are much harder things to resupply than a missile stockpile. And speaking of stockpiles, let's talk about who's actually stepping up to help fill the gaps, because this is a global story now, not just a two-country story. Allied nations have been quietly pouring resources into the missile defense supply chain to keep the pressure sustainable. Contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars have gone out for advanced interceptor systems, and some of America's closest allies in the Pacific have put in funding contributions that, in some cases, outpace what the American side itself has contributed to specific contract lines. When an ally is willing to outspend you on a joint defense contract just to keep your shared systems flowing, that tells you this isn't viewed as an isolated regional dispute anymore. This is viewed by American allies as a fight worth funding directly out of their own budgets, Because the alternative, letting a regime that executes protesters by the hundreds and openly threatens shipping lanes gain leverage over global oil routes, is a much scarier outcome for everyone involved. There's also a deeper story underneath the protest numbers that's worth sitting with for a second. This isn't a regime facing scattered, isolated pockets of unrest. This is a country where demonstrations broke out on a national scale, where security forces responded with lethal force on a mass scale, and where thousands were reportedly killed in the crackdown that followed. When American officials talk about wanting to embolden protesters, they're not talking about some abstract hypothetical population. They're talking about people who already stood up once, already faced live fire from their own government, and are watching every single headline about empty oil berths and merged command structures just as closely as anyone covering this conflict from the outside. A regime that has to execute this many of its own citizens to maintain order is a regime that knows exactly how fragile its grip actually is, and every additional piece of military and economic pressure from the outside makes that grip just a little bit harder to hold on to. Now here's where the proxy piece comes in, because Iran doesn't just fight with its own navy anymore. Not really, not after the losses they've taken. Iran fights through partners, and one of the clearest examples of that right now is happening in the Red Sea, where the Houthis, Iran's longtime partner in Yemen, claimed responsibility for striking Saudi Arabia's Jazan refinery, followed almost immediately by another claimed operation targeting Saudi forces in a Yemeni coastal city. That is not a coincidence, and it's not unrelated to what's happening in the Gulf. When the main regime is under this much direct pressure, when its own navy is bottled up, when its own command structure just had to be surgically stitched back together, the easiest and cheapest way to keep applying pressure without risking more of your own assets is to activate the network. Let the Houthis hit a refinery. Let them claim an operation against Saudi forces. It costs Iran almost nothing directly, but it keeps the region unstable, keeps oil markets nervous, and keeps the pressure spread across multiple fronts instead of concentrated entirely on Tehran. So when you put all of these pieces on the table together, here's what the picture actually looks like. You have a supreme leader who was killed in February, replaced by a son whose own health status has been a mystery for months, who is now finally being pushed out in front of cameras at the exact moment the regime needs to look strong. You have a military command structure so shaken by decapitation strikes that it had to merge two of its own institutions into one wartime headquarters just to keep functioning. You have an economy under a sanctions campaign specifically designed to hunt down every shadow banking route and every crypto workaround the regime has left, an economy that its own foreign ministry has effectively admitted is being successfully squeezed. You have an oil export system reduced to 3 critical berths, sitting empty for weeks at a time, while an oil slick spreads along the regime's own coastline near one of its most strategically important islands. You have an execution rate inside the country climbing past 900 for the year, a number that speaks louder than any press release the regime puts out about unity and resilience. And now, layered on top of every single one of those pressure points, you have the President of the United States going on record saying the United States has total control of the strait, and that Iran will get blown away if it tries anything further. That is not a random comment. That is a calculated message, delivered at the exact moment when every other indicator, financial, military, and political, shows a regime buckling under the weight of its own contradictions. It's a message that says we see exactly how weak your position actually is. We see the empty berths, we see the merged command structure, we see the execution numbers, we see the oil slick, and none of your tough talk on state television changes any of it. And Iran's answer, through its new security chief, was to repeat the same line they've been repeating for months, that the strait stays closed until their conditions are met. Except the numbers on the ground, 44 vessels redirected, 2 disabled, 2 boarded, tell a very different story about who's actually controlling that waterway right now. Well, let's also be honest about what could come next, because that's the part everyone actually wants to know. A regime this financially strained and this militarily exposed generally has 3 paths available to it. The first path is a genuine negotiated settlement, one where Iran actually accepts real terms instead of trying to dress up a stalling tactic as a legal framework. Given everything we just walked through, the path seems increasingly likely purely out of necessity, not desire, because the money simply isn't there to keep fighting indefinitely. The second path is continued proxy escalation, using the Houthis, using other regional partners, to keep applying pressure without directly risking what's left of Iran's own military assets. We're already seeing early signs of that with the Jazan refinery strike. And the third path, the most dangerous one, is some kind of desperate escalation from Iran's own remaining assets, whether that's an attempt to actually make good on threats against shipping in the strait, or some other move meant to prove the regime still has teeth. Given the pattern we've seen over the past several months, where every act of Iranian defiance has been met almost immediately with a harder response and tighter squeeze, that third path looks like the least likely one, if only because the regime seems to understand, deep down, that they simply cannot win a direct escalation right now. There's one more contradiction worth pulling apart before we get to what happens next, and it's the one hiding inside Iran's own negotiating position. For weeks, Iranian officials have been telling the world they're close to some kind of arrangement with Oman over a new legal mechanism for traffic through the strait, essentially trying to build a framework where Iran gets to dictate who passes and under what conditions. At the very same time, Iran's foreign ministry has said they are not currently engaged in direct talks with the United States at all and won't start until Washington addresses what they call violations of an earlier memorandum. So follow the logic here. Iran wants a legal framework negotiated through a third party that the United States never agreed to, while simultaneously refusing to talk to the one country that actually controls whether that framework means anything in practice. That's not diplomacy. That's an attempt to manufacture legitimacy on paper while avoiding the actual conversation that would settle anything. And it's a strategy that only works if the rest of the world plays along and treats Iran's unilateral framework as some kind of binding law. So far, the response from Washington has made it clear that isn't happening. Controlling a waterway on paper and controlling it in practice are two very different things. And right now, only one side actually has warships enforcing their version of the rules. What's fascinating is how transparent this entire chess match has become if you're actually paying attention to the details instead of just the headlines. Every move Iran makes on the diplomatic stage gets undercut almost immediately by their own internal numbers. They talk tough about a legal framework for the strait, while their oil berths sit empty. They talk about resilience while quietly merging their command structure out of desperation. They talk about strength while their own supreme leader has been hidden from public view for months. And every single time, the United States response has been the same: methodical pressure, applied consistently, without the kind of dramatic overreaction that would give Iran a propaganda win to hand off to sympathetic voices in international media. That patience, that willingness to just keep squeezing instead of escalating into something bigger and messier, is honestly one of the most underrated parts of this entire campaign. It's not flashy, it doesn't always make for a dramatic headline, but it's working, and the numbers we just walked through prove it. Now, before we wrap up, I want to know what you think is actually happening behind the scenes with Mojtaba Khamenei. Do you think this new footage they're planning to release is going to be enough to convince the Iranian public and the international community that he's actually healthy and actually in control? Or do you think this is just more theater from a regime that's been running theater since the day the war started? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because honestly, the range of opinions we get every single day is one of the best parts of covering this conflict in real time. And if you found this breakdown useful, do me a favor and share it with somebody who's been trying to keep up with what's actually happening over there, but keeps getting lost in the noise of corporate headlines that never connect any of these dots together. That's genuinely the best way to help this keep going. At the end of the day, here's the honest read on all of this. The United States didn't just send a chilling message to Iran's mullahs with words. The words were really just the label on top of a much bigger package. Months of blockade numbers, months of sanctions rounds, months of oil revenue getting strangled at the source, months of a military command structure showing visible cracks, and months of a population being executed in numbers that should embarrass any government claiming to be stable. When the president stood up and said the United States controls the strait and Iran will get blown away if it pushes further, he wasn't bluffing into a strong hand. He was stating out loud what the entire economic and military picture had already been screaming for months. The mullahs got the message. Whether they're capable of actually accepting it, given how much of their own power now depends on projecting strength they simply don't have anymore, is the question that's going to define whatever happens next in this war. And here's the piece that ties every single thread we've covered together into one simple idea. Every option Iran has left runs through the same bottleneck, and that bottleneck is money. Whether it's rebuilding a command structure, whether it's feeding a population that's already shown it's willing to protest even under threat of execution, whether it's funding proxy operations through the Houthis, or whether it's simply keeping the lights on inside a government bureaucracy, all of it requires cash. The regime increasingly does not have. Sanctions campaigns like the one currently running are specifically designed to choke that access off at every possible entry point, from traditional banking to shadow networks to digital assets. And based on Iran's own admissions about escalating countermeasures, that strategy appears to be doing exactly what it was built to do. So when people ask why the president feels comfortable making a statement as direct as total control of the strait, get blown away if you try it. This is why. It's not a bluff built on hope. It's a statement built on a financial and military picture that leaves Iran with fewer real options every single week this drags on. So that's where things stand right now. A regime cornered on every front, still trying to talk its way into leverage it lost a long time ago, and a military on the other side that doesn't need to shout to prove its point, because the numbers are doing the talking for them. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update, because with how fast the situation keeps shifting, there's a very real chance something changes before this video even finishes making its way around. Like this video, if you made it this far, drop your predictions down in the comments, and share this with anyone who still thinks this war is anywhere close to over. We'll keep tracking every single move, every single number, and every single contradiction coming out of Tehran, and we'll be right back here breaking it all down the moment something new drops. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.